So thank you for joining this virtual event. I'm thrilled to have all of you here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Edwards with the Teacher Enrichment Program at the Center for Excellence in Education. CEE was founded in 1983 by Joanne DeGennaro, who is actually still our president, and Admiral Rickover, who's the father of the nuclear navy and civilian uses of nuclear power. Our mission is to nurture high school and university scholars to careers of excellence and leadership in STEM. And we offer 3 cost-free programs in the United States, the Research Science Institute, USA Bio-Olympiad, and the Teacher Enrichment Program. A little bit about RSI. RSI is a highly competitive 6-week summer science and engineering program open to rising high school seniors. So they apply in their junior year. Traditionally, it's hosted at MIT, and students actually go and stay there for 6 weeks, work with professors, take classes, and they do their own original research project, which is very exciting. And many of them actually submit their work to like the Regeneron competition, Siemens, and a lot of them going on to advanced STEM degrees. And I've recently realized that being a lawyer is also a very popular option. Registration opens mid-November with applications due in early January. But now that you registered for an event, you'll get my teacher newsletter and all of those dates when those registrations open or close, any of that toss in the newsletter to let you guys know. We also have the USABO, which is the nation's largest biology education and testing program. Exploration, and we just invite people to explore the world of biology through the USABO. It is open to any high school student, and it's pretty much just a series of tests testing biology concepts. We invite our top 20 to join us for national finals, and they work on lab skills and do a lot of learning in those 2 weeks, and finally, it culminates in a competition. And the 4 from that go on to attend the International Biology Olympiad. If anyone here teaches biology, they have phenomenal teacher resources that are particularly good for AP and IB biology classes. Registration for schools actually opened last Friday. And if any of this sounds intriguing to you, please let me know, and I'll put you in touch with our USABO director. And lastly, we have the Teacher Enrichment Program. There's many familiar names here. So our big goal is to try to connect STEM experts with teachers and your students to explore cutting edge research and development and provide opportunities and resources that hopefully support you in your classroom. This year, we're doing a couple virtual bites of science, but I'm actually most excited about 2 new events that we're doing, which are college and career panels. And we are inviting institutes of higher education and some industry partners to come and talk about post-secondary STEM career training, education, and pathway options. I'm really trying to, for STEM teachers in particular, really trying to connect the dots of what that looks like and what are the options. And then the other exciting one is we have a new event called the Square Root of STEM, which are monthly virtual events where we try to explore from a couple of different angles a STEM topic of sorts, I guess is the best way to describe it. So our first one is in October. We'll be sending out some information about that, I think, early next week. And we're going to be exploring the olfactory system of dogs, of why dogs can do like bomb sniffing and drug sniffing. And looking at sort of some of the, what do we know about animal husbandry with training dogs to do this, and why are dogs good at sniffing things. I also want to make sure, in case you haven't seen it, last spring we got a new website, which is very exciting. And for teachers who have used the Lab Bench website, the Lab Bench is now actually on our website. So I'm really thrilled about that. If you ever want a classroom speaker, you want to connect with a STEM professional because you have questions about content area, you just want to, whatever your purposes are. If you want to connect with a STEM professional, just let me know. I'll see what I can do and reach out to some of my network, and my colleagues' networks as well. And because I'm so excited about this is what the new Lab Bench looks like. And then after this presentation, 1 to 2 weeks after, by the end of September, certainly, the video, the slides, some resources, all of that will be posted to the Lab Bench, and I'll let you guys know. I encourage you to check it out. There's some really great resources and some really phenomenal, just really engaging activities. And today we are very excited to have Amanda Smolinsky, who is the assistant professor of kinesiology at Roanoke College, and Jay Coe, who is a managing director of the Lightsmith group and also an RSI alumni. And with that, Amanda, I will just let you take it away.
All right, thank you guys all for coming out to Bite of Science this evening. My name is Amanda Smolinsky. I am currently a visiting assistant professor of kinesiology at Roanoke College, so right here in Roanoke and Salem. And I'm so excited to be talking with you this evening about some of my research and some of the things that you can do to improve the skills that your students will need if they want to pursue a degree in biology or anatomy specifically. So first of all, who am I and why am I talking to you, and what makes me think I'm qualified to be addressing you this evening? First of all, I got my biology degree, a bachelor's of science at Roanoke College. I graduated in 2008. And I focused on general biology just broadly, as well as doing a distinction project on zebrafish hormones during development. I then got my Master's of Philosophy, which is the British equivalent of an MA in Human Evolutionary Studies at the University of Cambridge. And then I took a few years off before starting my PhD in integrative anatomy, where I focused on clinical anatomy. So I took gross anatomy with med students and then focused the rest of my coursework on evolutionary biology and functional morphology. And while I was doing that, I also got a certificate in science outreach with over 100 hours of public outreach and coursework on public understanding of science. So that's what I look like on paper. I have, at this point in my life, 3 years of full-time teaching experience. Mostly in clinical anatomy. I just completed a postdoc in Denver at a medical school where I was teaching physician's assistants, masters in biomedical science students, and DOs, so doctor of osteopathy. And I'm currently starting my 2nd year teaching undergraduate anatomy and physiology labs here at Roanoke College. My research interests all stem from a basis in evolutionary biology. So I consider myself a biologist first, and any good biologist has to have some sort of root in evolutionary thinking. Within that, I specialize in anatomy, specifically of the musculoskeletal system, though I'm familiar with and have taught the entire body, including neuroanatomy. And I consider myself a functional morphologist. So what shapes does the musculoskeletal system take, and what does that allow an animal to do with those structures? So how does form relate to function? And my specific research interests lie in locomotion and skeletal biology. So if I were to give you all of that information or give you my CV, it would look like my path to becoming a scientist was fairly linear, but that is leaving out quite a bit of my journey. So let's go back to the very beginning. I feel like all kids are born scientists. They're always asking, why is this? And like, how does this work? And I feel like I never really grew out of that. So I feel lucky that I'm in a career where I never had to grow up and leave my inner child, kind of as it were. I was always inventing things or building things or trying to do science experiments in the kitchen, and trying to keep myself interested in science and active in science even as a kid. But it wasn't really until college that I decided that I wanted to pursue research. I originally wanted to go to med school because that's what smart kids did, and we didn't really, in my family, know anyone who was a scientist. So once I got into an academic setting and realized that I could have a job where my daily work was discovering things and making new discoveries was something that was new to me, and I was really excited by that. So I earned my biology degree and with an honors research project that I did working with developmental toxicology in zebrafish. So I did a project looking at how pesticides can disrupt growth and signaling in the embryos. And that was a really formative experience for me because it made me decide that I wanted to be a researcher, but it also let me know that I hate working with DNA and I don't ever want to pipette things ever again. So it really kind of set me on a career path where I knew I wanted to do research, but I knew I wanted it to be on something that I could see and hold and move around with my hands, not just under a microscope or in the computer. After graduating, I took a gap year where I did about 3 months of behavioral research looking at the effects of pharmaceuticals on mice and zebrafish, and I realized I hated that too. I wanted to do again something that I could hold and touch and be like, this is the thing that I'm working on. So after I got out of that, after that summer, I worked as a pharmacy technician. Just to kind of make ends meet before I then applied to that master's program. I knew I wanted to work with fossils. I knew I wanted to figure out how bodies worked and moved around. So I spent my 10-month master's degree looking at pelvic morphology as apes evolved into humans and comparing those and how those animals move around and how we came to move around. And I feel like that was a really satisfying thing for me mentally and really put me on the trajectory of what I wanted to focus my career on. After I got back, I actually took 3 gap years. As soon as I got back with my master's, I worked in a dog kennel for 1.5 years, where I got to scoop poop as my daily job. So my mom likes to joke that I spent however many thousands of dollars to be the most overqualified dog kennel assistant in the country. But I did eventually apply and get a neuroscience research job where I was working with memory in rats. And my job was to build the implants that they would put in the rats as they ran mazes so they could detect their neurons firing as they ran mazes. So that was a really fun job. I got to work with my hands. I love the work there, but I don't think neuroscience was really the direction for me, but it was a line on my CV that I could use to get me to where I wanted to be. So I eventually then finally entered a PhD program at the University of Missouri, where I was going to work with bones and movement. I wanted to look at fossils, but also relate them to how animals move today. So kind of an evolutionary spectrum of how does evolution work, how do structures evolve, and how do animals use bodies to move around, so locomotion. So I decided to specialize in functional morphology of the locomotor system. Once I defended my dissertation, I started a postdoc at Rocky Vista University in Denver, Colorado, where I was teaching clinical anatomy. So I had the background for my PhD in anatomy from a medical perspective, and I did 2 years learning how to teach, how to write exams, and how to become a better professor. And that was a limited time job. So now I'm here at Roanoke as a visiting assistant professor of kinesiology. So I have a 3-year term, and I'm going to be working with students who are either pre-med or on some sort of pre-occupational therapy or physical therapy or sports training track. So that's where I'm at now. So look at that in pictures. That was kind of a lot of words. So the majority of my job is teaching. Here's a picture of the lab bench last week. I was teaching anatomy and physiology of the peripheral nervous system. So we have bone models, the skull and the spinal cord, and I really love interacting with students, especially in the small class sizes that we have here. Another part of my job, though, is doing research. So designing experiments and conducting experiments and getting those, analyzing things and getting them out and out into the world. I've gotten to work with numerous different animals as models. So zebrafish and mice and rats I mentioned earlier, but I also did a project looking at the strength of the alligator mandible. So how strong they are. They can bite really hard, but how does their head resist those forces? So that lots of different animals that you can work with as an anatomist. I also had the opportunity to go for a week for 2 summers to dig up fossils near Richmond, where it was Carmel Church Quarry. So here's a picture of me digging a few years ago, and we dug up a few whale jaw fossils, and this is a turtle humerus here, so both live and fossil animals. But you don't just get to do research, you also have to communicate your findings. That's part of being a scientist. So I have gone around the country and actually to Europe as well to talk about my research and share ideas with other scientists. And then down at the bottom here is a picture. I've been an invited speaker at events like this and at museums where I get to talk about my research as part of public outreach. And like I said, public outreach is one of the things that I am really passionate about. So I also have volunteered at museums. I do outreach events with schools and with the community. And I actually got a chance to turn some of my research into a stand-up comedy routine with a group called Science Riot that takes real scientists and has them tell stand-up just to get people excited about science and see what scientists are actually like in a funny way. So it's kind of all of my job in picture form here. And you get to go all over the world. So if you like travel, maybe being a scientist is for you. So I've got blue dots here and all the places that I've gone to school, but I've also, or work, but I've also traveled around the country for these scientific meetings to collaborate with other scientists, to go to museums and look at their collections. So I get to travel around a lot too, which is great. So I'll spare you talking about some of the teaching. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and I'll focus mostly on, for the rest of the talk, on the scientific research portion of my job. The job as being an assistant professor it's required to get promoted that I have a functioning research lab, that I bring students in and give them research experiences. And depending on the type of school that I'm at, or that a student ends up at, it can range from, it's nice to bring in a little bit of grant money and apply to the NIH or whatever and get that, to it's expected that you'll bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars and support your own salary. So depending on the institution you end up at, it can be very different how much research is required to support your job. So I like where I'm at here, where I can kind of balance my teaching with some research. I'm also expected to publish papers and be engaged with the scientific community in my field. And that goes on my resume and helps get me promoted. And then I have to mentor students in research experiences. So bring in students who are interested in doing science so that they can have an experience like I had, help decide, is this the career for me? It helps them get into medical schools, dental schools. It looks good on a resume there. And just to foster that sense of discovery in other students, even if they're not going to go into a career for research. So speaking of the research that I like to do, I'd like to now kind of pivot to what I'm interested in, the kind of projects that I work on. I am interested in locomotion. How animals move around through their environment is essential to vertebrate behavior. It underlies behaviors like searching for food, escaping predators, finding mates, defending territories. So locomotion is something that all vertebrates have to do, and it really underpins their lifestyle. And if we take a look at their skeletons, we can see that there are all sorts of ways that bones have adapted to allow different types of movement through the environment. And what I'm interested in is how, over evolutionary time, these shapes of bones come to be and what they allow animals to do. So the types of questions that I ask as someone who's interested in locomotion and the skeleton are, what does the shape of a bone tell us about how an animal moved around? So these are the forelimbs of a horse and an armadillo, and they contain the same bones, but you can see they're shaped very differently because they do very different things. Horse limbs are long and tapered so that they can move more quickly and allow the horse to run, while an armadillo's arm is really short and stocky and strong with big muscle attachments, so it can provide powerful strokes for digging. So just looking at the bones of these animals, we can tell what they did while they were alive. I also looked at how bones change as animals adapt to new environments. So here we have an example again of the forelimb of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale. And again, the colors match up to homologous bones. So they're all made of the same bone identity, but those bones are bigger or smaller or fatter, depending on the function that they serve. So having elongate bones is good for running or flapping, whereas the whale has kind of shortened up some of those other bones to make a good flipper. And we can tell that it's adapted to the new environment. And finally, how do bones grow and change over a single animal's lifetime? So the shape of a bone in an embryo is different from that of an adult, and it continues changing and growing and responding to signals throughout an individual's ontogeny. And one of the questions I'm interested in looking at is how does this individual change relate then back to evolution? So let's take a look at what bone is and why I think it's exciting. So bone is a mechanically sensitive tissue. It can sense and adapt to physical forces that are placed on it. So the contractions of muscles or impacts with the ground are going to induce microscopic bends and twists in the bone that it can sense. And most of the time, those forces are going to fall in this physiologic loading zone. We can see on this graph that as strain increases, we tend to get increases in bone mass. Well, at the same time, if we fall out of this physiologic loading zone, bone mass tends to decrease. So it's kind of a use it or lose it system with bone. So for example, here we have the cannon bone of a horse. So it's one of the wrist bones. And you can see how thick it is there. And this is just a normal exercised horse. But if we then take that animal and we don't exercise it at all and becomes a couch potato, what we see is something very different in the bone. It's sensing that the bone cells are sensing that they're not being used. So why waste material and energy maintaining that bone when we could just resorb it and do just as well? So you can see here in this trivially loaded horse bone that it's much thinner here up at the front, and it's full of all these tiny little holes where calcium has been resorbed. So as if you don't use bone, you tend to lose material that builds it. At the same time, the opposite is true. So here is a silhouetted cross-section of the humerus or upper arm bone of a person. And this is just a normal humerus. But if we take that person and train them as an athlete from a very young age, the thickness of that bone increases, and so that it's the same outside diameter, but the inner marrow cavity has shrunk and filled with bone. So these are actually scans from the same individual. One is the playing arm, which is thick, and the other is the non-playing arm, which you can see is much thinner. So this doesn't just happen overall in the body, this is happening on each side of an individual. So from this observation, I wanted to ask the question, what type of forces or what types of exercise can grow the strongest bones? So I actually went through the scientific method, which you're probably teaching some of your students. My observation was, we know that bone changes in response to exercise or locomotion. So I developed a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that high impact exercise, such as jumping up and down, will cause bones to grow stronger than if there was muscle-driven exercise. So muscles pulling on bones tends to be different than impacts. So I designed an experiment using mice to look at the thigh bone and look at changes on bone shape and density. And I designed an experiment. So I have my 3 experimental groups here. I had mice that did jumping, mice that swam, which is removing impact and just muscle driven. And then I had them running on wheels, which is a combination of impacts with the ground and strong muscular contractions. And that was my control group. I had mice who just stayed in their home cages and did no exercise. So my methodology was to have those mice do their exercises, and then we would CT scan their bones. We would take those CT scans and using computer software, build 3D renderings of the bones in the computer. And then we would take cross sections of the bone from the middle here, which looks like this, and analyze those for shape and bone mineral density. So that looks something like this. The measurements that I take are from, we would go in at each of these cross sections of the grid and measure bone mineral density so we could get an idea of what the average is over the entire cross section. And then we would take measurements of structural strength. So here's where we bring in things from engineering like bending resistance and torsion resistance. And those are based on diameters and the thickness of the walls and the spacing of the material around the center. So there's a lot of math involved with these. And here are just kind of jumping to the results. I won't bore you with too many details. What we found was that bone area and in diameter, we actually found significant differences depending on the type of exercise that the animals performed. So we've got on these x-axes down here which group they're in, and then on the y-axis we have bone area and diameter from anterior to posterior, so size. What's interesting is that we found that in the running and the swimming groups, rather than exercise leading to increased bone strength, it actually led to smaller, thinner bones, which is associated with a weaker shape, which is really interesting because we have read up on this saying that exercise should improve and increase bone strength. So that was really strange. If you want to take a look at what that looks like, here are some examples of the control group, and you can see how thick it is on this backside, whereas in the swim group, it's a lot thinner. So we were really puzzled by this. And we had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new hypothesis. Maybe the bone material, so bone mineral density, is what's changing, so that they can afford to be lighter in these weaker looking shapes because they're changing the material and they are actually stronger. So then what we did was take a look at bone mineral density. I had a student working on this over the summer, and we found that looking at averages for bone mineral density, there actually is no change. So we've got, again, on the x-axis our treatment groups, our exercise groups, and then we have relative measure of bone mineral density on the y-axis, and each of these dots is a mouse, and then the red dots are the average and standard error. So you can, there's a tendency, again, for run and swim to actually be weaker, but based on the spread and the number of mice we have, it's not really significantly different. So we come to the conclusion that we have decreased structural strength from the shape, but bone mineral density is the same, which means that the bones in these two muscle-driven exercises, running and swimming, are actually weaker than if they'd done no exercise at all, which is completely contrary to what we expected to happen. So how do we interpret this? Our next step in the scientific method. So we found that bones could potentially become weaker after exercise, but we know that other researchers have found that exercise increases strength. So we figure genetics has to be playing a role here in how bone responds to exercise. Everybody's different, right? So just like I can go to the gym and someone else can go to the gym and work out, and I might not gain much muscle, but someone else might. Like, I'm just not built for gaining muscle. At the same time, people can do the same exercises and either gain bone or lose it. So genetics is playing a larger role here than we originally thought. It's also possible that maybe the femur isn't the best place to look for these changes. We are planning to move on and look at other bones of the limb. We're looking at the tibia next to see maybe position within the limb, there's some sort of gradient that will yield different results in different bones. So there's exciting stuff coming up in the future. So what does all this mean for you as a teacher? There are a lot of skills that I use every day when I'm trying to do this research. Those are science skills like creative and critical thinking, going back to the drawing board and coming up with creative answers for problems, designing experiments where I have to think critically about what could be influencing what's going on, how to control different scenarios, troubleshooting problems. And then these last few are ones that we're having trouble with our freshmen in our class now, making and interpreting graphs, drawing conclusions from data, constructing an argument supported by evidence rather than just the thing you learned in the textbook and I'm gonna parrot that. Like, no, use the numbers in this graph and tell me why you have evidence for your argument. And then, especially with anatomy, using these 2D images from x-rays and things like that and thinking in 3D and moving those shapes around in your head. So those are all science skills that you need to have if you're going to go into this line of work. But there are also non-technical skills as well, kind of soft skills that a lot of our incoming students also have problems with at the college level. Time management, organizing their notes and their writing, study skills. If they've gone through high school without having to study much, by the time they get to college, they don't understand what it means to study. It's not just reading over your notes the night before a test. You have to make flashcards. You have to really sit down with a group and work through your answers. You can't just parrot things. You need to understand why they happen. And then efficient use of references. I don't have every detail in my field memorized. I have to look things up, go back to textbooks, go back to published papers. So how can I search for and find that information quickly? And finally, just knowledge. And this would be stuff coming from textbooks and that they would learn from class. So biology is really inclusive in that we have to draw from chemistry, math, physics, and skills in writing to be a good biologist. Big picture biology principles are often where we get our hypotheses from before we go and look at specific instances and see if they fit with theory. And then just being able to use and be familiar with products like Microsoft Office. I had to tell a student earlier last week that he has to actually install Microsoft Office before he can work with the spreadsheet for his homework. So just, they're digital natives, but they're not necessarily familiar with some of the software that they're going to need for the rest of their careers. And then there are experiences that you can give to students who are thinking of becoming future biologists. Look for volunteer opportunities. There are places you can sign up to go to Utah and go on a fossil dig for 2 weeks. You can work at museum collections, being a fossil preparator or any sort of collections that they have. Shadowing opportunities are also available. See if there are any science or health themed community or after school programs in your area. I know I've personally worked with underserved middle schools and had kids who wanted to be doctors when they grew up come in and look at our dissection lab, and they had a great time and asked some really good questions and got them excited about science. You in your classrooms can contact scientists to Zoom in and do little lectures or guest talks. One example would be something like Skype a Scientist, and they do K through college, I think, where you can just, I want a real live scientist to come talk about their job for a day with my class. I've had a lot of fun doing that too. As they're getting closer to graduating and going to college, encourage your students to look up colleges that have undergraduate research experiences. Not all colleges let undergraduates do research. So while they're looking, they can look up UROP, which is Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program. And they often offer stipends to do that. They can also look at the department that they're thinking of majoring in and look at what the faculty work on to see what kinds of opportunities are available. And then here at Roanoke College specifically, we have a research fellows program where you apply as a college, high school rather, senior, join as a college freshman and to work in a lab and receive a small scholarship and get paid to do research during your time here. So that's a program for interested students as well. With that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time, and here's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. You know, maybe an audience clapping if we were in person. Just figure I'd let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, so now for some teacher questions. One we have is, so you had mentioned the bone density, like the bone thickness of like the tennis player and their, tennis, like their playing arm versus their non-playing arm. And like, does that bone, I guess my question would be, does that bone thickness then have like impact kind of anything about their like muscular skeletal system?
Yeah, so the bone becomes thicker, but usually when you're done growing, it becomes thicker towards the inside, so it's not really pushing stuff out of the way. But in some cases, it can leave what are called muscle scars. All those little bumps on your bones on a skeleton are actually from muscle attachment sites. So there are some anthropologists who think that actually you can tell if you find a burial site somewhere, whether the local people were like paddling canoes or throwing spears or something like that, just based on the shape of their bones. It's pretty cool.
That is very cool. And let me see what else we got here. What's fun? And I guess when and I might have spaced out and missed it, so like
it's okay.
Well, it might be my fault. But what's your? So I know you had mentioned a couple of new sort of like ideas, but like this mouse bone density question that you have. What do you think is your most likely sort of avenue, if you have any?
To move forward with the research?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to start up probably next month looking at different bones. Like maybe the thigh bone isn't the place to look. Maybe it's the shin bone instead. So we're going to look there. There have been other papers saying that maybe there's some sort of concentration gradient of the forces, like your foot's hitting the ground and maybe that force dissipates by the time you reach the thigh. So it's not really receiving the signal like, hey, I should beef up to resist this force. So maybe the shin's the place to go. If we don't see anything there, it's entirely possible that maybe the genetic strain, the background of these mice is such that they don't respond to exercise, and it's a genetic background thing. I know anecdotally, I had, when I was doing another science outreach event, someone came up to me and said, like, I'm 40 years old and have osteoporosis, and my doctor keeps telling me to do exercise and nothing's happening. I just keep losing bone mass. And I think that's the kind of result that doesn't get published a lot, because it's not what we want to see, and it's kind of, we would call that like a negative result. Maybe we're just not doing the experiment right. But I think the genetic background is definitely an avenue for research for how bone would respond, because everybody's different.
Yeah. And then so I have a teacher here who just started, they teach research methods, and they just started a biomechanics course. And they were wanting to know if you had any suggestions for labs, or like biomechanics labs or lab equipment, especially that's cheap, because budgets are limited out there.
Yes. I don't work with biomechanics specifically. I know you can get software like Bone Load, but I think that is probably pretty expensive. One of the things that I like to do that's free is you can go on a website like Overt or Morphosource and look up different skulls of different animals that people have CT scanned and uploaded, and just compare the shapes and look at like how big is this area for muscle attachment. Like they have a big sagittal crest like a hyena or something, because they bite hard and that's where all those muscles attach. Things like that. Comparing skulls is a really easy. If you have real skulls to show them, that's even better. But some of the weird ones that are hard to get copies of, I like using the online ones, because they make like 3D PDFs that you can spin around in 3D, so it's fun.
They are really fun. Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. So we have Jay Coe, who is the managing director of the Lightsmith group. And I'm so thrilled to have him here. And thank you so much, Jay, for joining us a little bit last minute and short notice. So I'm really excited to hear your presentation. Jay is attended our Research Science Institute program.
So I will do kind of three things. I think I just saw the tail end of Amanda's presentation and realized that I am like partially prepared for this conversation, but not entirely. And those are the following. I'll try to provide a little bit of background and context for myself, which sort of just explains kind of what I am doing now and how my background kind of relates to the work or to the STEM experience on the educational side, as attenuated as that is, and then talk about the work that I'm doing now and how it relates in some cases to hopefully some of the work that you guys are doing, and then try to leave you with a few thoughts at the end. So my name is Jay Coe. I am one of the founding team and managing directors of a firm called the Lightsmith Group, which is a private equity investment firm. So we invest in private companies globally. That's entirely focused on sustainability. And the area that we're focused on is called climate resilience and adaptation in the climate change context. And so I'll explain what that is and what that means. But just to give you a little background on myself, this is just a little chronological slide that we took out of one of our marketing presentations that just sort of explains kind of how I got to what I am doing today. And that might provide you with some potential insight about what your students' trajectories might be going forward as well. So I was a math and science kid, as Kim had said. I attended the Research Science Institute in 1987, the year after Admiral Rickover passed away. And so my first real paid job was an internship at the National Institutes of Health, Building 10, Laboratory of Mathematical Biology, in the early days of sequencing genomes, and we're looking at protein structures and ion channels and trying to figure out if there was conserved structure inside different types of ion channels that would be related to drug discovery, which is how everybody gets grants, I guess. But after having been a high school student very focused on science and math and research, I ended up studying economics at Harvard, graduating in '92, and then ending up doing a master's at Oxford in management studies, and then ending up in the private equity and private investment industry. So I joined a firm called the Carlyle Group, which is a global private equity firm, in 1993 at the very early days of private equity, and was there for 2 years then, and then again for about a 7-year stretch in the 2000s period. But many of these areas that I invested in ended up being related to areas of science and technology growth in particular. Back then, Carlyle was a quite small firm. It was only 24 people. We had just finished our first investment fund, which was $100 million. So today the firm is, I think, over 1,200 people, most of whom don't live in the United States, and manages over $300 billion of capital. And at that time, former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci and former Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor David Rubenstein from the Carter administration were some of the senior partners at Carlyle, and I actually ended up working there because they also served on the board of the Center for Excellence in Education. So I then went to Yale Law School and then ended up clerking for the U.S. Court of Appeals and then the U.S. Supreme Court for Justice Souter, then came back to the investment industry, spent some time working in hedge funds, and then in the 2010 period, ended up serving in the U.S. government in an agency called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, now known as the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, focused on international development, sustainable investments, particularly, as I'll describe in a bit, around climate change and resilient resources use. So renewable energy, energy efficiency, agriculture, water, infrastructure, and a variety of other development-oriented activities. My work in investing at Carlyle was also focused in two areas that are quite related to technology. So those were security, including cybersecurity, as well as the technology, media, and telecom space in the wireless sector. So I was an investor in the early days of cellular network deployment and second generation and third generation deployment and the development of Wi-Fi, for example. When I returned to the private sector after President Obama's his re-election in 2012, I joined another private equity firm called Siegler Guff, and then in 2016, at the end of 2016, I founded Lightsmith with a partner. But I also was pulled back into government service in a number of ways. In that period, I serve on the board of the New York State Energy Authority, which is tasked with the strategy of trying to get New York State to 100% clean electricity by 2040, as well as provided advice to the UN's Green Climate Fund on how to engage the private sector in investing around climate change, and then launched a working group with the UN Secretary General that's now structured as a US nonprofit called the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group. So I've had several different phases of my career, starting from being a really focused math and science kid to studying economics and then law, and then working in finance and then working in international development, and now taking all those sets of skills and focusing on the impacts of climate change. So why don't I try to provide you with a little bit of background on what I'm doing, which hopefully is will be useful and interesting as an application potentially of some of these areas of science and technology that you may all be involved in teaching about. What I want to talk to you today about is climate adaptation and climate resilience investment. So in the area of climate change policy, the way that the Paris Agreement works, the one that was signed in 2015, or the UNFCCC process, the kind of global negotiations around climate change, they define two areas of action around climate change, which is a little bit artificial in terms of siloing, but they describe an area called mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the scale and scope of climate change. This involves reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It will eventually evolve, I think, taking carbon dioxide directly out of the air or trying to fix it in other ways. So it's just trying to change the trajectory of climate change. And then there's an area called adaptation, which is adapting to the ongoing risk and impact that is now occurring because of climate change. And if you read the recent IPCC sixth assessment report, or at least the summaries of it, I think the baseline expectation now is that there'll be a minimum of 1.5 degrees of warming, which includes some heroic assumptions about technology deployment and finance and policy. And at that level, there's dramatic amounts of change that start to occur. We're only at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming today. And we have absolutely new phenomena like gigafires and fire tornadoes and increasing amounts of unprecedented rain and storms and so on that are disrupting everything. So what I want to talk to you about is the area of adaptation and climate resilience. So adaptation is a really big problem. Just dealing with the effects, even at 1.5 degrees of warming, is considered to be an enormous challenge. Estimates by the UN are that it could cost up to $300 billion per year in developing countries by 2030. I think that number will eventually be revised upwards. And so it's an enormous challenge that's out there and could be as much as $500 billion a year by 2050. So it's a very big problem. You can see this in just the activities and impacts on a humanitarian basis, on a primary basis, and a secondary basis across the world in 2020. We're also marking new territory in 2021 with record fires in Europe and in the United States and Australia, in parts of Africa, and then enormous amounts of extreme weather events that I think everyone's quite familiar with now that are causing both humanitarian tragedies, but also now impact to the entire society and the economy as well. And you can kind of see the actual impact that we're focused on as investors in some of the increasing spending that's now resulting from these natural disasters. So for example, the 10th largest utility in the United States, PG&E in California, declared bankruptcy in 2018, pled guilty to numerous counts of homicide because their equipment and transmission lines were responsible for sparking that killed a large number of people and destroyed enormous amounts of property. That's led to the surviving utility in Southern California spending over $1 billion a year now, up from over $500 million in 2019, and that spending is just accelerating. Similarly, Cape Town, you may remember, almost ran out of water in 2018. Chennai, a major city, a multi-million person inhabited city in India, ran out of water completely in 2019 and are now accelerating the amount of spending to try to deal with these problems. But the challenge is, even though there's a very, very large and growing complex problem across multiple parts of the economy and society because of climate change, very little is being done about it. So less than 5 to 6% of all of the finance tracked on the planet Earth regarding climate change has anything to do with that, adapting to climate change or building resilience to climate change. And virtually none of that's happening in the private sector. So you can kind of see this, the tiny little red circle here on what's called the spaghetti chart shows you that less than $30 billion out of the almost $600 billion that's tracked globally has anything to do with adapting to climate change, and less than $500 billion of that comes from the private sector. So it kind of makes sense up to this point. If we could solve all of climate change through mitigation, there'd be no need for adaptation to climate change. But unfortunately, even at 1.5 degrees of warming, there's an enormous need for dealing with the scope of the problem. So the UN is really focused on this, but the UN Secretary General this year set a 50-50 goal to deploy capital against adaptation. This has consistently been a problem. The global climate talks that are going to be held for the 26th time in Glasgow in November has also really focused on trying to accelerate activity there. And the new administration has also set very strong goals to increase the amount of focus on adaptation and climate change as well. This is also part of the international development landscape, which is looking for common approaches to defining this, to invest in it, and especially to think about how we recover from COVID in a way that actually builds a more resilient future. We manage, as I described, a working group that's focused on this, that sits at the intersection of several different areas: private investors, public sector, governments, climate experts, companies, other stakeholders, to really have discussions about how the impact of climate change will affect investments and how you can invest against the impact of climate change. So one of the things that we did that I think might speak a little bit to having a STEM background is to try to define what it means to do adaptation. So we managed a project with an awesome acronym called the ASAP project, or the Adaptation SME Accelerator Program, which is a great acronym because it has an acronym inside of it. And that is designed to do three things. One is to identify what is a company, a small to medium-sized company, small to medium-sized enterprise, that is involved in helping to adapt to or build resilience to climate change. So we created a taxonomy that was in peer review that I'll talk about in a minute, and mapped over 100 companies each in Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean. The second thing we did was to try to integrate them together into a living network of similar types of solutions, companies in the technology area. And then we're launching an accelerator program with an existing set of accelerators to try to scale these companies up. What we would define as a company that's involved in adaptation and climate resilience, which is a big, vague topic in some ways, is to really start by saying, what are the actual IPCC or German Watch or scientifically identified climate vulnerabilities that are going to emerge in specific regions over specific timescales, and then find companies that have technologies to either assess or help us understand how those risks and impacts will play through society and the economy, or help to manage physically, financially, or otherwise those impacts as they play through society. So if you have a vulnerability and you can find a technology that can help you understand it or help you manage it, then we would describe those things as supporting adaptation and climate resilience. We, in our own investment strategy, focused on 6 areas of technology-related services and products that we think are very relevant to assessing and managing the climate risk problem. 4 of them here on the left side involve data and analytics specifically. We think that's a critical area to understand so that we can actually take action. So we'll look at companies that do precision agricultural and agricultural analytics to understand how agricultural stress will occur. We also look at companies that are involved in supply chain management, where there's a weather volatility component or weather modeling incorporated into it. Supply chains have been massively disrupted by the COVID crisis, which has shut down borders, but also changed a lot of consumer and purchasing behavior. All of that complexity and challenge has been compounded by lighting large amounts of the world on fire, increasing the amounts of tropical cyclones and hurricanes, flooding large parts of different parts of the world, and doing everything from shutting down parts of the Panama Canal to making it impossible to ship steel out of Germany because the Rhine River no longer is passable in certain times of the year. In addition to that, geospatial imagery and mapping, critical to understand how climate change will affect different sets of assets and communities in motion and at rest, is understanding what the geography is and how to layer analytics on top of that. And then the broader, more targeted area of catastrophe risk modeling, the modeling of natural disasters in the insurance reinsurance sector, weather analytics, weather modeling all fall under that category. So you can see how technology background, the scientific background applied, and engineering background applied in these specific areas of the economy and society form a big core part of our thesis. We also do look at some technology-enabled products and services categories in the area of water intervention, so water efficiency, water harvesting, and also in the broad category of resilient food systems. And these should be somewhat unsurprising as 2 of the major areas that are being impacted right now and clearly identified by the IPCC are water scarcity as well as inundation and impact agricultural productivity. there's a broad number, an increasing number of areas of technology that will be impacted and can help us to assess and manage the risk and impact from climate change. So for example, even though it's not one of these categories, we've also been looking at companies that do medical diagnostics. Disease vectors are moving around because of the effects of climate change through waterborne and airborne disease, but also increases in human health impacts from airborne pollutants. If you light lots of things on fire, it changes your respiratory ailment probabilities, as well as impacts from changes in vector-borne disease like mosquito populations changing because of humidity and temperature changes. So for example, when I was growing up, Lyme disease was like not as serious an issue as it's understood to be today in the mid-Atlantic. But as the winters have gotten warmer, deer tick populations are not dying off at the same rate. And now you've got endemic Lyme disease in a much larger part of the United States. That also will be true of chikungunya, dengue fever, yellow fever, and Zika. So what is an example of one of these companies? This is one that we've actually invested in. It has sort of a unique technology that was developed by an Arizona state-based material scientist. So this is a company called Source Global that's developed a technology called hydro panels. These look, as you can see in this picture, very much like solar photovoltaic panels. Instead of using solar energy to generate clean electricity, however, these panels use a proprietary material to adsorb water vapor from the air, and using a combination of solar thermal energy and a little bit of solar electricity are able to condense that into pure drinking water. So these panels today generate between 5 and 9 liters of pure drinking water under almost any set of atmospheric conditions on the planet. And they can be deployed in the same way that solar electricity has been deployed in these types of rooftop deployments or large fields, and start to solve some of the critical scarcity issues that we're going to see on an increasing basis for drinking water in multiple parts of the world. So the technology has been deployed in about over 40 countries around the world. And so this represents one of the water efficiency or water harvesting technologies that we talked about here in the tech-enabled products category. We're also actively looking at companies today that do agricultural analytics. They're evaluating how agricultural productivity is being impacted. Things in supply chain analytics, where you're starting to reroute shipping of everything from normal Amazon products to personal protective equipment and vaccines in the face of the COVID crisis, when you disrupt logistics in the supply chain through giant wildfires or storms, everything from the California fires to the Texas freeze that happened in February. So just as background, another area that might be of interest when you think about applications for backgrounds in STEM education, we do track and measure the environmental and social governance risk of the investments that we're making, so that we make sure we don't have any negative effects in those areas. And we track by tracking different key performance indicators in each of the companies that we invest, what we think the non-financial impact of those investments actually are. So I don't have that much more to my presentation, which I'm happy to answer questions about, but I thought I would leave you having seen the end of Amanda's presentation, with a couple of thoughts about how this may or may not be relevant to the extremely important education activity that you guys are involved with. And these are the following. I would say I absolutely value the experience that I had as a math and science student that was involved in research in high school, that led to my interest in studying economics as a kind of quantitative application to public policy. And that background also very much in the quantitative sense is important to doing financial analysis and so on. So that kind of basic approach to structured thinking, thinking about things in logical blocks that connect to each other, has been important in applications in my career that were further honed through law school, but also approaching investments in technology. So for example, when I started investing in cybersecurity, I actually went through an accreditation program to learn how to actually deploy firewalls and understand a bit about the different architecture of approaches to cybersecurity applications in probably the 2000s period, understanding how telecom investments we're going to be affected by regulation, but also the different possible benefits of different technology deployments in different spectral ranges, propagation characteristics. Investing around companies that provide that kind of data and analytics has been, I think, informed by that experience in science and math education. And so I think, in kind of the substantive work that I do in finance, in economics, in areas of technology related applications in investment, all of these things inform my background. So I'd say whether your students go on to stay in careers in STEM or move on to finance or law or policy, that background is a core fundamental experience that's been important. The second thing I'd say here is, I have had a particularly disorganized career that ranges from finance to law to international development, and now have brought all of those different experiences hopefully together to help attack one of the larger problems that is out there and increasing the effects side of the climate change problem. So I'd encourage you to think about the work that you're doing with students as preparing them for careers that may have many different phases to them, and where understanding the language of science and math, and also engineering and other areas, but also public policy and translating that experience from one area to another, or applications in finance, or working between different sets of fields is really critically important. So having a baseline understanding of how science and math and engineering works and how to translate that into policy or finance or investment is a critical preparation for a future which I think will have much more complexity to it and much more, many more different stages in people's careers going forward as well. And the final thing I would leave you with is a kind of a fundamental challenge, which is to really encourage as much as possible this kind of integrated, systemic, or transformational approach to these kinds of problems. And that is by contrast to incremental approaches that are out there in the technology landscape and in the development landscape and in the societal landscape. So what I really mean by that is the former head of the Global Environment Facility, which is a UN multilateral agency, Naoko Ishii, said, in the context of climate change, what's been interesting is in the mitigation side of things, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we took a dramatic step towards a systemic and transformational technology transition. So rather than saying we have oil and gas and coal and let's just gradually reduce the carbon output of those industries or those fundamental energy technologies, 5, 10, 20% a year, we will move entirely to a different energy architecture and technology and feedstock. So rather than a carbon-based energy system, we're going to move to one that's based on wind and sun and water resources. And we're going to do that in a way that's much more agile, that's more distributed, and then fundamentally cleaner. And so that is what transition we're in right now, which is a vast systemic and transformational transition, one that is going to move our energy architecture that direction. That same transformation has to happen across every aspect of society. Agricultural productivity has to be dramatically more carbon friendly, transportation on top of it, buildings, communities, the supply chain, everything. And in a similar way, what Naoko Ishii's challenge is in the area of adaptation, which is very early in ideation, people's ability to think about it or beginning to plan for it. We also need to start taking maybe a systemic or transformational approach. So rather than simply saying we're going to build the seawall 1 foot higher this year or retreat from the coast 1 more mile, because the rate of change and the potential for systemic feedback and step change, which if you understand it from the scientific standpoint, can be dramatically more impactful than the kind of average person's visceral understanding of what is likely to happen going forward, then you'll realize the need that we have to have pretty dramatic changes in the way that we organize our societies and our economy. And so rather than thinking about incremental approaches to that, resilience to climate change or adaptation to climate change, thinking about systemic integrated approaches that are transformational, living with flooding, working with natural capital as one area, or nature as a solution. So allowing wetlands or mangroves or other sources of flood abatement, natural sources of flood abatement, begin to defend our cities and our communities and our assets as a component of that. I'm thinking about how everyone's resilience is dependent on everyone else's resilience. So there's a very famous picture of a house on the panhandle of Florida that was the only house that was built to hurricane resistant specifications. And so in the field of destroyed buildings was the only one standing, which is great for the owner of that house until he realizes that he doesn't grow all of his own food, make all of his own medical supplies, supply all of his own energy, or work as an individual. So his resilience is dependent on everyone else's resilience. And so beginning to approach these kinds of challenges, which are going to be among the most difficult and existential going forward, in a systemic way, in a transformational way, in a way that thinks about different architectures and the interdependencies, is something I would highly encourage. So I'll end this with two short stories because I don't have that much more prepared to say. One is one of the things that occurred to me from a scientific background from years ago was I was sitting next to the chairman of the IPCC, who's a Korean scientist, at the climate change talks back in, I think, 2018, just before the IPCC had released its 1.5 degree report, talking about the differences in impact between 1.5 and 2 degrees, which are dramatic. And at 1.5 degrees, things are also pretty dramatic, but it gets a lot worse at 2 degrees. And beyond 2 degrees, 2 degrees is not okay. 2 degrees is the level at which most scientists believe we at least have some ability to understand what the likely outcomes are going to be, as opposed to the possibility of really systemic feedback and step change kind of impacts that are out there. And the thing that really frightened me that was said in the course of that presentation was we asked him about the 1.5 degree report, and he said, look, I can't really tell you anything about that, it's embargoed. But what I can tell you is two things. One, the 1.5 degree projections and the 2 degree projections are 2100 projections. And so they are very long timescale projections. And so you should understand those are assumptions that are there. And so we sort of nodded their heads and we understand that and so on. And then the second thing he said, which is what if you have any kind of a scientific perspective or no simple ways to interpret math, was what is also clear from the IPCC's 6th assessment, which is, and both of these scenarios assume a material deployment of carbon reduction technologies. So when I heard that, I looked at it and I said, I can't, the implication of what he's saying is the curve of these two projections, the 1.5 and 2 degree projections, arcs out from where we are today over to 2100, and somewhere from 2050 on, there is a dramatic set of assumptions about reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. And if, so, math shows you that if you're going to bend the curve down, you're assuming you're going to bend the curve down by deploying all these technologies which bends the curve down, that what that really means is the current trajectory, absent those new technologies, means that we will way overshoot those two possible targets, the 1.5 and 2 degree targets. And then heroic efforts will be required, including the deployment of this technology, to kind of bend us back down to the outcome that we're talking about at 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is quite frightening. And from an investment standpoint, a policy standpoint, a technology standpoint, what he's really saying is magic, because no current technology is at a price or a technological capacity today that can get to the scale required to take all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to get us to the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios that are currently being assumed. So on the one hand, understanding what he was trying to explain and the the kind of frightening outcomes required you to understand and translate his kind of conservative, because the IPCC is very conservative, it's consensus oriented view of kind of how challenging the future really looks. Now, the flip side to that is I am really happy that I have a 12, 10, and 5-year-old set of children, 2 boys and a little girl. And when I look out over the 10-year life cycle of my investments, I don't know what will happen after COVID or the political system or anything else, but I have a pretty good feeling that over the next 10 years and 20 and 30 years, when my 5-year-old will be 15, 25, 35, there will be dramatic changes in the environment, and the effects of climate change will be felt at this point. So that is the challenge ahead of us. And the question is, what did you do about it? Did you invest in the science and technology to help assess that and manage that transition as we face it, or not? Did you prepare your students for that future, or not? Did we accelerate the development of the technologies that we're absolutely going to need to kind of bend that curve going forward to even get to a state of change that we can begin to kind of prepare to live with? So that's the work that I'm involved with from that background. I will say that I am a technological optimist for all that I've said there. I'm an equity investor. I invest in the upside. And in the kind of long-term, Ehrlich versus Simon debate, I'm on the Simon side, where technology finds a way, people find targets, they reduce costs, they transition, they shift. The political environment may not be that optimistic right now, but I think that there is technology that can be developed and finance mobilized and entrepreneurship and energy directed at this. And so I really applaud all the effort that you do in educating students and directing them and preparing them for this future, because they're going to inherit this set of challenges. And I think technology and the STEM backgrounds are going to be critical to helping to overcome that, to meet those challenges and to generate a better future. So I'll pause there. I don't know if I've gone way over time or not, but hopefully that's a helpful perspective and something that's additive to your conversation.
Your timing is perfect. So congratulations, fabulous timing. And also I loved your presentation. I think it in some ways so important that, especially if teachers are required to teach about climate change, is to you're giving some context to sort of the challenges and issues I think we all see in the news every day. And I think what's most impressive to me is I can see all the STEM skills that you have as you describe your work. So, and I'm sure that other teachers who are with us tonight can also see that, because it's that systems thinking piece, right? And being able to look at data and tell a story with whatever information you have. So I loved it. So a couple questions from teachers. I guess, so one is, there's a good number of nonprofits who are doing some really interesting work in terms of perennial wheat crops, and trying to do soil reclamation through that. I guess, how does some of the work that nonprofits do intersect with your work at all?
Absolutely. And as I said, we do chair a nonprofit that we were sort of cajoled into launching together with the UN Secretary General at the Paris Global Climate Talks. And that's really to focus attention on how all this climate science then and the effects of it crashes into investment, because in order to solve these problems, you need to mobilize a lot of money to actually make that work. So when thinking about these components, there's certainly a tremendous amount of work that governments need to do, and a tremendous amount of work that academia needs to do. So I have now I think joined the 5th National Climate Assessment as an author, a part of the chapter on international finance and as it affects climate change. And in the NYSERDA role that I sit in the oversight from the board perspective, that's a research and development agency focused on energy and the energy transition entirely. So there's absolutely basic information, basic data that needs to be provided and generated. So we are looking actively at the company side of that. So in order to take that technology and then deploy it in the real economy, professors and scientists and policymakers can't just usually hand it to people or hand it to communities. that ends up being dependent on grant writing or philanthropy, which is really important and critical. But is somebody that comes from the investment and private sector, a self-sustaining model is if you can make a business out of it, then it will sustain itself. And so most of the food you eat isn't grown by scientists or by the government. It's grown by agricultural companies, right? Or by farmers, and they buy their seeds from companies. So taking that technology and deploying it is what we're most interested in from the investment standpoint, and doing that at scale, right? There's not enough money in academia or in the government to do this. So we're actively looking at companies that do that commercially develop and sell based on the basic science, salinity resistant and drought resistant seeds, for example, or are taking research analysis about biological additives to soil that will dramatically increase uptake of nutrients and help to address some of the problems on agricultural productivity and so on. So where the intersection and hand up happens is government, basic science, basic research, then applied research, applied science, and then the financing and business model deployment of that ends up scaling it to the rest of the economy. So that's how we think about approaching it. Similarly, I was an adjunct professor, I do some adjunct teaching at SEPA, the policy school at Columbia, and there was a really interesting Earth Institute event that was done jointly with the Columbia Business School, where they were looking at the fundamental modeling of weather and natural disasters and how that impacts real estate values. And those two connections end up becoming incredibly important if you really want to think about how you plan communities going forward, what the equity and justice issues are. The populations that are going to take it on the chin here are the populations that always do: poor people, disadvantaged populations, developing countries. And so taking that data and making it applicable, making it actionable, that's a critical first step in making it happen.
Yeah, no, and I think, certainly, yeah, it is you need to scale things. And I work for a nonprofit, and scaling is hard for nonprofits. You're not great at such things. And then, so you, and I know, so this is, do you also look at kind of some of the material science companies that are out there? So things like, we're assuming that, I guess, the technology is an example of a focus.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of companies who do very interesting, porous concrete.
Sure, so we have positioned this fund, which is one of the first in the world to focus on the effects of climate change. This is considered to be, by a number of academics, the first private investment fund focused on adaptation and climate science. Everybody else has been focused on let's solve the problem entirely, which we're also very in favor of. And I think you need to do both, right? Mm-hmm. You need to play offense and defense, and the offense you're playing has to be appropriate for the defense. There's several bad examples of wind turbines that have failed because the wind stopped blowing because of climate change. And there's some highly energy efficient buildings in Houston, for example, that were flooded above the entryway to the building because they were energy efficient but built in floodplains. So that doesn't help you with your carbon strategy. You need to design for a single world that is low carbon and resilient to climate change. So we are growth stage investors. So ours, we have what, as a child of the 1980s, would call the MacGyver strategy, which is go look for the stuff that's lying around and use it now to fix the problem, right? So technology absolutely has to continue to be developed for the future applications. Carbon capture does not exist at scale at technological capacity to do this yet. You'd have to reforest a huge chunk of the world to do a lot of these different things if you want to use that kind of technology, for example. But there's lots of advances there. What we're doing is taking a growth approach, which is beyond the venture capital technology risk area. So we're not, wondering if you build it, will he come by then? We're looking at companies that could scale now through capital, which is less risky. And so proving out the idea that you can even do this at all is kind of a first order condition. And then you can sort of think about whether you go early or whether you go later in terms of deploying capital to generate returns. Because our fundamental theory of change is if we can prove you can make money helping to fight the impact of climate change, then a lot more people will do it. And if a lot more people do it, then we will get close to the scale of capital required to tilt the entire world economy towards a lower carbon and more resilient future, because that's the world we're going to all live in. So yes, in this case, the hydro panels company is a clear application of really novel material science application, but then also a lot of software and engineering around how to optimize when you're adsorbing water vapor from the air and then when you're releasing it, over multiple different geographies at different altitudes, different temperatures, different relative humidities, and so on. So it's absolutely the application of fundamental technology. We're taking the phase of it where it's going to commercialize and scale, and because we don't think you have a lot of time to waste. But the future will be built by technologies we probably haven't imagined yet that will hopefully have that systemic and transformational approach.
Awesome, thank you. I'm trying to see. Okay, quick question because I'm personally interested in this one. So you mentioned measuring non-economic impacts. I guess could you speak a little bit about like what that means and like how do you measure non-economic impacts?
So this is a big challenge because there is the potential for what I call the Esperanto problem, which is people invent a whole bunch of new languages that nobody else wants to ever speak. So if you start tracking information in a proprietary way that you can't compare against anything else, you just end up with data that doesn't get comparable to anything else. And so what we have done is to take an approach where there are in the what's called the impact investment world, where people are looking for both a financial return and an environmental or social benefit. There are different frameworks that have been created where you can agree we're going to track this kind of benefit. So when we try to track across all the different types of technologies that we invest in, what we would describe as direct or indirect beneficiaries. That's at different levels of generality. So in a water panels company, I can tell you how much water those panels produced, where they did it, whether it was a water scarce region or not, how many people are benefiting from that, what the carbon footprint displaced was, because what bottled water or trucked water or desalination would cost you as an alternative in that place. And so I can track direct beneficiaries that get water, and I can cut that by income level, and I can cut that by gender if I can track those statistics, which is what we do. It's more difficult to compare that as an apples to apples against catastrophe risk modeling, which is literally the measurement of how natural disasters destroy things, right? And so if you model natural disasters, that can inform early warning system deployments, which it has. So, hey, people, get out of this location or you'll die. If we can do that sooner, if we can do that faster, if we can do that more credibly, you can dramatically reduce the amount of humanitarian impact. So one of the companies that we were looking at did the national flood maps and a lot of the catastrophe risk maps for India. There were severe flooding incidents in the spring of 2020 in India that resulted in about the same amount of material damage to property, which you can't easily move around, but dramatically reduced the amount of loss of life because you were able to much more quickly warn people, evacuate them, plan your evacuation routes, and so on. So how do you measure the direct benefit of catastrophe modeling? Well, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. If you don't have the models, you can't take the action, but just because you have the models doesn't mean you will necessarily take the action. So you are trying to get directional data that can then be compared. So what we're trying to do is gather for the first time how the specific investments you're doing over some time period generates direct and indirect benefits to people. We're also looking at the total amount of land covered by certain kinds of modeling or other statistics that we can start to compare. And as we start to have that data, we can start to then think, is this your best return on investment to do this kind of investment or this kind of investment? So this all kind of, what we don't have in adaptation is what you have in mitigation, which is sort of a common currency. In mitigation, the unit of figure of merit is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent avoided, and you can calculate that whether it's generating renewable energy and displacing other sources, or through transportation, or through food production, or through water supplies, or anything else. There is no similar agreed metric in adaptation because it's multi-sectoral. I proposed different approaches to that in some thought pieces that I did back in 2015. You can look at a frontier of risk. You can look at a basket of risk that has water and agriculture and people and buildings and other things in it, just like a basket of currencies is used by different people. And so no one's agreed on that yet. And so waiting to agree on that is also not a good idea because we don't have enough time. So we're trying to measure it in each of the different sectors we're doing, and then harmonize that with approaches like the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN and other approaches that are out there.
Awesome. I mean, I personally have 1,000 more questions for you, and I could probably talk to you about what you're doing in climate change for I don't know, probably a couple of hours because I have a lot of questions. But it's 6:30, so we are out of time, which is probably fortunate for you. So just to wrap up for everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, my speakers, Amanda and Jay. Thank you so very much for sharing what you do and the STEM skills and all of that. And just, I'm actually really excited. I'm off to a great start of the TEP school year. So thank you, everyone. For my teachers who are here, I will be, I'll send you guys an update when materials get posted to the Lab Bench website. Please, what do I say? If you're here, I will send you certificates as well, so you can use it for your purposes. I'll send some contact information for our speakers. And Jay, yes, thank you. I also believe that optimism in action is key, and I am also very hopeful about technology solutions for climate change. I think that's probably our best shot. And lastly, I need to thank our sponsors who provide my salary, pay for a website, when I go back to traveling, pay for me to travel. And that's Akamai Technologies, Amgen, Amazon, Arnold and K. Clegg Charitable Foundation, BAE, the Commonwealth of Virginia Clogmore Charitable Foundation, Gilead Sciences, Illumina, Jack Kent Cook Foundation, Jacobs Engineering, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, Lockheed Martin, May Family Foundation, Psychemetics Corporation, Spark Therapeutics, TC Energy, Virginia Department of Higher Education, Vulcan Materials, and WestRock are our sponsors for this session. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a very wonderful day.
Thanks so much. And thanks for all your hard work as teachers out there. And thanks to the Center for Excellence in Education. Thank you.
Yeah, Jay, I'm just really excited someone's finally did, like your entire investing firm. I'm super pumped about it. I think it's awesome.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank
Amanda.
you.
For the presentation too. It was great. Thank you.